Homer Lawson had ridden past the weathered trading post at Willow Bend, crossing more times than he could count over 11 long years, never once suspecting that the sharp-eyed young woman weighing out flour behind its counter carried his own blood in her veins. It was the autumn of 1878, and the herd he drove numbered close to 800 head, lowing and kicking up dust along the trail that ran from his ranch outside Casper down toward the railhead at Cheyenne. The Wyoming Territory sky stretched wide and pale above him, the kind of sky that made a man feel small and forgotten, and Homer had felt that way more often than not since the summer his whole world had come apart on the banks of a swollen river. He was 42 years old, broad through the shoulders though the years of saddle work had begun to stoop them, and his beard had gone the color of ash long before its time. Men who rode with him said he was fair and steady, a man who paid his hands on time and never raised his voice unless a life was at stake. What they did not know, because he rarely spoke of it, was that Homer Lawson had once had a wife named Clara and a daughter named Josephine, and that both of them had been swallowed by the North Platte River 12 years before, somewhere east of where he now made his home. The trading post at Willow Bend crossing sat where the trail bent along a slow curve of the river, a low building of squared timber and sod roof with a covered porch that had seen 1,000 travelers come and go. A hand-painted sign read Archer's Trading Post, the letters faded by sun and rain, and beside it hung a bell that travelers rang if they arrived after the doors were shuttered for the night. Homer had stopped there on every drive since 1867, buying flour and coffee and salt pork, trading gossip with whoever stood behind the counter, and moving on without a second thought. This year, as he swung down from his horse and looped the reins over the post's hitching rail, he noticed the young woman sweeping the porch before he noticed anything else about the place. She could not have been more than 18 or 19, slim and quick in her movements, with dark hair pulled back beneath a faded blue kerchief and eyes the color of good strong tea. There was something in the way she tilted her head when she caught him watching her, something familiar that Homer could not name, and he told himself it was only the tiredness of the trail playing tricks on an old man's mind. "Afternoon," she said, resting the broom against the porch post. "You look like a man who has been eating trail dust for a week." "Closer to 2, Homer said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Homer Lawson. I run cattle up from near Casper. Been stopping here, going on 11 years now." "Then you have been coming here longer than I have been old enough to remember much of anything," the young woman said, and there was a light, easy laugh in her voice that struck him strangely, though he could not have said why. "I am Grace Archer. This is my aunt's post, though most days it feels like mine." "Archer," Homer repeated, glancing toward the open door where he could see shelves stacked with tins and bolts of cloth. "Silas Archer used to run this place, if my memory serves." "My grandfather," Grace said. "He passed some years back. My Aunt Lenora kept the post going after that. I have been helping her since I was small." Homer nodded slowly, filing the information away the way a man files away most idle conversation, without any sense that it mattered. He asked after flour and coffee, and Grace led him inside with the easy confidence of someone who had spent her whole life among these shelves, weighing goods and making change, and talking to strangers who came through with the dust of 100 different trails still clinging to their boots. It was inside, in the dimmer light of the post, that Homer first felt something catch hard in his chest. Grace reached up to fetch a sack of flour from a high shelf, and as she stretched, the collar of her dress shifted just enough to reveal a thin white scar along her collarbone, the kind a person might get from being dragged across sharp rocks. Homer's breath went shallow. He had seen a scar like that before, on a summer evening in 1863, when Josephine had tumbled from the tailgate of their wagon and caught herself on a broken axle bolt. Clara had cried over that wound for a week, certain it would scar her baby girl for life. It had. "Something wrong, Mr. Lawson?" Grace asked, noticing his stillness. "No," Homer said, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. "No, ma'am." Just an old man's aches catching up with him. He told himself it meant nothing. Scars were common enough on the frontier. Children fell and cut themselves on wagons and fences and rocks every single day of their short, hard lives. It was only foolishness, he told himself, the kind of foolishness that came from carrying grief so long it began to see its own reflection in every stranger's face. But that night, when a sudden squall rolled down off the mountains and turned the trail to churned mud, Homer found himself unable to push the thought from his mind, and when the post's proprietor, a woman named Lenora Archer, offered him and his trail hands shelter in the barn rather than risk the herd in the storm, he accepted with a gratitude that had less to do with the weather than with wanting more time near that scar and the young woman who bore it. Lenora Archer was 36 years old, and she moved through her trading post with the quiet authority of a woman who had built her life out of necessity and had never once complained about the shape it had taken. She was not a small woman, not delicate in the way some men preferred, but there was a strength in her jaw and a warmth in her gray eyes that Homer noticed even through the gray sheets of rain as she directed his hands where to bed down the horses. "You are welcome to the loft," she told him, raising her voice above the wind. "There is hay enough for the animals and blankets enough for the men, though I cannot promise you much beyond that." "It is more than we hoped for, ma'am," Homer said. "We are grateful." "Do not thank me yet," Lenora said, though there was the faintest curve of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "You have not tasted my stew." The stew, as it turned out, was good, thick with venison and wild onions, and Homer ate 2 bowls of it at the long table inside the post while his hands settled in around him, talking low about the herd and the weather and the price of beef at the railhead. Grace moved between the kitchen and the table, refilling cups of coffee, and Homer found his eyes following her more than once, unable to shake the strange, insistent feeling that had settled into his chest since that afternoon. When the meal was done and most of the hands had gone out to check on the horses one last time before turning in, Homer found himself alone at the table with Lenora, the fire crackling low in the hearth, and Grace's laughter drifting faintly from the back room where she was putting away the last of the supper dishes. "She is a fine young woman," Homer said, nodding toward the sound of Grace's voice. "You have raised her well." Something flickered across Lenora's face, quick and guarded, gone almost before Homer could name it. "She is not my daughter by blood," Lenora said carefully, "though I could not love her more if she were." Homer set down his coffee cup. The rain drummed steady against the roof, and somewhere outside a horse stamped restlessly in its stall. "How did she come to you, if you do not mind my asking?" Lenora was quiet a long moment, her gray eyes fixed on the fire. "It was 12 years ago this past summer," she said at last. "I was still a young woman then, helping my father run this post. There had been terrible flooding along the North Platte that season, worse than anyone could remember. One morning I went down to draw water and found a child washed up in the reeds along the bank, half drowned, burning with fever, no more than 6 years old. She could not tell me her name. She could barely speak at all for the shock of it. My father and I nursed her back to health, and when no one came looking, when we could find no trace of a wagon train or a family within 50 miles who had lost a child, we took her in. I named her Grace because it seemed to me that surviving what she survived was nothing short of a mercy from God." Homer's hands had gone very still around his coffee cup. The fire popped and hissed, and he found he could not draw a full breath. 12 years, he said slowly. "You are certain it was 12 years?" "I have marked the day every summer since," Lenora said, watching him now with a curiosity that was beginning to sharpen into concern. "Mr. Lawson, you have gone the color of ash. What is it?" Homer set down his cup with a hand that was not quite steady. "In the summer of 1866, he said, "my wife Clara and I were traveling west with a wagon train bound for the Oregon Territory. We had a daughter, Josephine. She was 6 years old. There was a flood on the North Platte, a bad one, worse than the wagon master had ever seen. Our wagon overturned in the crossing. My wife drowned trying to save our girl. When the water calmed and the wagon train regrouped, Josephine was gone. We searched for 3 weeks. We never found her. Everyone told me she must have drowned, that the current would have carried her body far downstream, that there was no chance a child so young could have survived alone in that water for more than a few hours. The color had drained from Lenora's face. "Where?" she said, her voice hardly more than a whisper. "Where did this happen? How far upstream from here?" "Near Ash Hollow," Homer said. "Perhaps 60 miles east of where we sit now as the river runs." Lenora's hand rose to her mouth. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The only sound the rain and the fire, and faintly from the next room, the sound of Grace humming an old tune to herself as she finished her chores. A tune Homer had not heard in 12 years. A tune Clara used to sing while she worked. A lullaby about a bird flying home. "Homer," Lenora said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, "I think you had better sit very still and let me fetch something." She returned a few minutes later with a small wooden box, the kind used to store keepsakes, and from it she withdrew a scrap of blue calico, faded and worn thin, no larger than a man's palm. "This was tied around her wrist when I found her," Lenora said, laying it on the table between them with the reverence of a woman handling something sacred. "I have kept it all these years, hoping someday someone might recognize it, though I confess as the years passed I gave up truly believing anyone ever would." Homer's hands trembled as he reached for the scrap of fabric. He knew it before he even touched it, knew the pattern of small white flowers on pale blue, because Clara had sewn that very calico into a dress for Josephine's 6th birthday, cutting the scraps into a ribbon to tie back her daughter's hair. He had watched Clara stitch it by lamplight not 3 weeks before the flood took her. "This is my wife's calico," he said, and his voice broke on the words. "This is Clara's. This was Josephine's hair ribbon." From the next room the humming stopped. Grace stood in the doorway, a dish towel still in her hands, looking between the two of them with the confused, cautious expression of someone who has walked into the middle of a conversation she does not understand but senses, in her bones, concerns her more than anyone has yet said aloud. "Aunt Lenora," Grace said slowly, "what is happening?" Lenora rose from the table, and for the first time since Homer had met her, he saw real fear cross her face, though he could not yet understand its shape. She crossed to Grace and took both of her hands. "Grace," Lenora said, "I need you to tell me something, and I need you to try very hard to remember, even though I know it has always been difficult for you. Do you remember anything at all from before I found you? Anything, even a fragment?" Grace's brow furrowed. She had been asked this question before, over the years, by well-meaning travelers curious about the strange story of the trading post's orphan, and always she had shaken her head and said the past was a fog she could not part. But something in Lenora's tone tonight made her close her eyes and try harder than she ever had before. "A song," Grace said slowly. "There was a song about a bird, and a man's voice, deep, calling me Josie. I always thought I dreamed it." Homer stood so fast his chair scraped hard against the floorboards. "I called her Josie," he said, his voice thick. "Only I ever called her that. Clara called her Josephine proper, but I always called her my little Josie bird." Grace's eyes flew open. She stared at Homer as though seeing him for the first time, taking in the shape of his face, the color of his eyes, searching for something in his features that her heart seemed to recognize before her mind could catch up. "I do not understand," Grace said, her voice trembling. "What are you saying?" Homer crossed the room slowly, the way a man approaches a spooked horse, careful not to make any sudden movement that might frighten her away. From inside his coat, with hands that would not stop shaking, he drew out a small tintype photograph, worn soft at the edges from 12 years of being carried close to his heart. It showed a young woman with dark hair and a gentle smile, holding a small girl on her lap, the girl's face turned laughing toward the camera. "That is my wife, Clara," Homer said, holding the photograph out to Grace. "And that is our daughter, Josephine, taken not 2 months before we lost her in the flood." Grace took the photograph with trembling fingers. She looked at it for a long, long time, her eyes moving between the laughing child's face and some private, half-buried memory Homer could not see. When she finally looked up, tears were streaming down her face. "That is me," Grace whispered. "I know that is me. I do not know how I know it, but I know it the way I know my own hands." The trading post fell silent except for the rain and the fire, and the sound of three people breathing. Three lives that had been torn apart 12 years before by a flooded river, now standing together in a small room lit by firelight, trying to understand how grief and mercy had conspired to bring them back together. Homer reached out slowly, and Grace did not pull away, and when his arms closed around her, both of them wept the way people weep when a wound that has never properly healed is finally, achingly, allowed to close. Lenora stood apart from them, watching, her own eyes bright with tears, and on her face there was a joy so profound it was almost indistinguishable from grief, because even as she rejoiced to see this reunion, some small, honest part of her heart understood that everything about her life was about to change, and she did not yet know if she had the courage to face what that change might mean. The rain fell all through the night, but inside the trading post at Willow Bend Crossing, no one slept. Homer sat at the table with his daughter beside him, and for hours they traded fragments of the story, filling in 12 years of silence with the small, precious details that made a life. Grace told him of waking in a stranger's cabin with no memory of her own name, of Lenora's patient, endless kindness, of growing up among the shelves of flour and calico and trail supplies, learning to read from an old Bible and a stack of dime novels left behind by travelers, learning to shoot a rifle and bargain with fur trappers and mend a wagon wheel because there had never been anyone else to do it for her. Homer told her of the years he had spent searching, of the ranch he had built near Casper because he could not bear to travel any farther from the place he had lost her, of the nights he had lain awake wondering if she had suffered, if she had called for him, if she had died alone and frightened in the dark water without ever knowing how desperately her father had searched the riverbanks for her small body until his hands bled from clawing through the brush. "I never stopped looking," he told her, his voice raw. "Even after everyone said it was hopeless, I looked for years. I just never thought to look here, because Ash Hollow and Willow Bend are 60 miles apart, and no one believed a child could survive being carried that far by the current. I do not remember the water," Grace said quietly. "I only remember waking up warm and Aunt Lenora's face above me and her singing to me until I fell back asleep." Lenora, who had retreated to the kitchen to give them privacy, but who could not bring herself to go far, stood in the doorway listening, her arms wrapped tight around herself as though holding in something that threatened to break loose. Near dawn, when the rain had finally slackened to a soft patter and the first gray light was beginning to touch the eastern sky, Grace rose from the table and crossed the room to where Lenora stood. She wrapped her arms around the older woman and held her tightly. "You saved my life," Grace said. "Nothing that happens now changes that. You are my family, Aunt Lenora, and you always will be, no matter what else I learn about where I came from." Lenora held her close, her face pressed against Grace's hair, and for a moment she allowed herself to weep freely, the fear and joy and grief of the night finally spilling over. "I have loved you since the moment I pulled you out of that river," she said. "I always knew that someday, if God was kind, someone might come looking for you. I only did not know how much it would break my heart when they did." Homer, watching the two women embrace, felt something shift in his chest that he did not fully understand yet, a tenderness that went beyond simple gratitude, though he pushed the thought aside for the moment, too overwhelmed by the enormity of what the night had already given him to examine it closely. The days that followed were strange and full, unlike anything Homer had experienced since Clara's death. He sent word ahead with 2 of his trail hands to continue the herd on toward Cheyenne under the charge of his foreman, a steady man named Otis Doyle who had ridden with Homer for years, and did not blink twice at being told his boss would be delayed at Willow Bend Crossing on account of family business. Homer himself stayed behind, unwilling and unable to leave his daughter so soon after finding her, and Lenora, though she said nothing of it directly, seemed glad enough to have him stay. He fell easily into the rhythm of the trading post, a rhythm that felt strange to a man who had spent 11 years driving cattle and running a ranch, but not unwelcome. He helped Lenora repair a section of fence that had washed out in the storm, hauled feed sacks that were too heavy for the women to manage alone, and in the evenings sat at the long table while Grace told him stories of her childhood and he told her stories of her mother, trying to give her back some of the years that had been stolen from them both. It was on the third evening, after Grace had gone to bed exhausted from the emotional weight of it all, that Homer found himself alone with Lenora on the porch, watching the last light fade over the river that had once nearly killed his daughter and had instead, through some strange mercy, delivered her into the care of a woman with a heart big enough to raise a stranger's child as her own. "I do not know how to thank you," Homer said, leaning against the porch post beside her. "There are no words for what you have done. You gave her a home. You gave her a life. If not for you, she would have died alone in that river, and I would never have known what became of her." Lenora was quiet for a moment, her eyes on the darkening water. "I did not do it to be thanked," she said. "I did it because she was a frightened, motherless child, and I could not have lived with myself if I had turned her away." "All the same," Homer said, "I owe you a debt I cannot repay." Lenora turned to look at him then, and in the fading light her face seemed softer than he had yet seen it, some of the guardedness gone from her eyes. "You owe me nothing, Homer Lawson. But I will admit I have grown afraid these past few days, afraid that now you have found her, you will take her away from me, back to your ranch, and I will be left alone in this post with nothing but the memory of the daughter I raised." Homer considered this carefully before he answered, because he understood the fear behind her words, and he did not want to speak carelessly about something that mattered so much to both of them. "I would never ask Grace to leave the only home she has ever known unless it was truly her wish," he said. "And I would never ask her to leave the woman who saved her life and loved her as her own. But I will tell you this, Lenora. I have spent 11 years riding past this trading post, stopping here to buy flour and coffee, never once suspecting what I would find. I do not believe that was only chance. I do not believe any of what has happened this week was only chance." "What are you saying?" Lenora asked, her voice low. "I am saying that I do not intend to be a stranger who found his daughter and then rode off with her, leaving you behind as though you were nothing more than a keeper he was borrowing her from," Homer said. "I am saying that whatever happens next, I would like it to happen in a way that keeps all three of us together, if that is something you would want as well." Lenora's breath caught, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, only studied his face in the dim light as though trying to determine whether he meant what she thought he meant. "That is a great deal to consider, Homer, after only a few days." "It is," Homer agreed. "I do not ask you to answer tonight. I only wanted you to know my heart on the matter, so that you are not lying awake afraid I mean to steal your daughter away from you the moment my herd sells at the railhead." Lenora smiled then, a small, genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes, and something in Homer's chest loosened at the sight of it. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "It eases my mind more than you know." They stood together on the porch a while longer, not speaking, simply watching the stars come out over the river, and though neither of them said it aloud, both of them understood that something had begun between them that night that went beyond gratitude, something neither of them had expected to find again after the losses that had shaped their separate lives. The peace of those days did not last as long as any of them might have wished. On the fifth morning after Homer's arrival, a rider came up the trail from the east at a hard trot, raising dust behind him, and Lenora's face tightened the moment she recognized the man's black coat and silver watch chain glinting in the morning sun. "That is Jasper Reed," she said quietly to Homer, who had come out onto the porch at the sound of hooves. "He works for the Territorial Land Office out of Cheyenne, though everyone along this stretch of trail knows he is more interested in lining his own pockets than serving the territory." Jasper Reed was a tall, narrow man with a thin mustache and the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He dismounted with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and he tipped his hat to Lenora with exaggerated courtesy that did nothing to soften the hard calculation in his gaze. "Miss Archer," he said, "I trust you received my letter." "I received it," Lenora said, her voice flat, "and I sent back my answer, which was no." "A pity," Reed said, "given that the railroad survey has confirmed what I told you months ago. This crossing sits directly in the path of the proposed spur line to Rock Springs. The territory is prepared to offer you a fair price for the land, Miss Archer, but I must remind you that if the matter goes before the land office for review of your title, there is some question as to whether your father's original claim was ever properly filed. Without clear title, the territory has every right to simply take the land for the railroad's use and offer you nothing at all." Homer felt his jaw tighten at the barely concealed threat in the man's words. "That sounds to me like a fine way of telling a widow she ought to be grateful for whatever crumbs you choose to throw her," he said, stepping forward. Reed's eyes flicked to Homer with new interest, taking in his dusty trail clothes and the confident set of his shoulders. "And who might you be?" "Homer Lawson. I run cattle out of Casper, and I have been stopping at this post for 11 years. I know for a fact that Silas Archer filed his claim properly back in the 60s, because I have seen the surveyor's marks myself on my way through." This was, in fact, a small exaggeration, since Homer had never examined any such marks closely. But he said it with such flat certainty that Reed's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "Seeing marks and having legal documentation on file with the territorial office are two very different matters, Mr. Lawson," Reed said, recovering himself. "I would advise you not to concern yourself with business that does not belong to you. Miss Archer's business became my concern the moment she opened her home to my daughter and gave her a life when she had none," Homer said, his voice hard. "I will be looking into the matter of this claim myself, Mr. Reed, and I expect you will find the paperwork is in better order than you are hoping." Reed's smile thinned, but he said nothing more on the matter, only informed Lenora that the land office would expect a decision within 30 days, before mounting his horse and riding off in the direction he had come, leaving a taste of unease hanging in the air behind him. "He has been trying this for months," Lenora said once Reed was well down the trail. "Ever since word got out about the railroad spur. I have written twice to the land office in Cheyenne to confirm my father's title is on file, but I have received no answer either way, and I confess I do not know what I will do if the paperwork truly has been lost." "Then we will go to Cheyenne ourselves," Homer said. "I have business there anyway, selling the herd, and I would rather spend a week making certain your title is secure than leave you here at that man's mercy." Grace, who had come out onto the porch during the exchange and watched it all with growing anger on her behalf of the woman who had raised her, spoke up then. "I am coming too. This is my home as much as it is Aunt Lenora's, and I will not sit here waiting to hear whether some land agent has decided to steal it out from under us." Lenora looked between the two of them, father and daughter standing shoulder to shoulder in her defense, and something in her chest ached with a gratitude too large for words. "I cannot ask either of you to trouble yourselves with this," she said. "It is my burden to carry." "You did not ask," Homer said gently. "We are simply telling you how it is going to be." 3 days later, the three of them rode into Cheyenne together, Homer having arranged for Otis Doyle to hold the herd at a stockyard on the edge of town until the matter of the trading post's title could be settled. Cheyenne in the autumn of 1878 was a bustling railhead town, full of the noise and dust of cattle pens and freight wagons, saloons spilling piano music into the streets, and the constant clang of the blacksmith's hammer from the shops along the main thoroughfare. Homer found it a strange contrast to the quiet of Willow Bend Crossing, and he could see Grace taking it all in with wide, curious eyes, a young woman who had spent her whole life at a lonely trail crossing, now walking the streets of a real frontier town for the first time. The land office was a squat brick building near the railroad depot, and the clerk who greeted them, a young man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous manner, seemed reluctant to produce any records at all until Homer made it plain, in the flat, unhurried tone he used when a man was trying to cheat him on a cattle sale, that they would not be leaving until the matter was resolved one way or another. It took the better part of 2 hours, and the intervention of the land office's supervisor, a heavy-set man named Mr. Grier who seemed embarrassed by the whole affair, but eventually the truth came out. Silas Archer's original claim had indeed been filed properly in 1861, but a clerical error some years later had mistakenly recorded the parcel under an incorrect section number, leaving it to appear, on cursory inspection, as though the land had never been claimed at all. It was precisely the kind of error that a man like Jasper Reed could exploit to convince a widow her land was not truly hers, when in fact the mistake belonged entirely to the territorial office itself. "This is an injustice," Grier admitted, red-faced, as he compared the old ledger entries. "Miss Archer's title is entirely valid. I am sorry for the confusion this has caused. I will see the record corrected today, and I will send written confirmation to Mr. Reed that the parcel is not available for railroad acquisition without Miss Archer's consent and fair compensation." Lenora sat very still through all of this, her hands folded tight in her lap, and when the matter was finally settled, when Grier handed her a signed and stamped copy of the corrected record, she let out a breath that seemed to carry 12 years of quiet worry along with it. "Thank you," she said softly. "You do not know what this means to me." "It should never have happened in the first place," Grier said. "Women who hold land alone on the frontier face enough hardship without our own office adding to it through carelessness. You have my apology, Miss Archer, and my assurance the matter is closed." Outside, in the busy street, Lenora turned to Homer and Grace with tears standing in her eyes, though this time they were tears of relief rather than fear. "I do not know how to thank either of you," she said. "I have spent months lying awake worrying I would lose everything my father built, everything I have spent my whole life protecting, and in the space of an afternoon you have set it right." "You did not lose anything," Homer said. "The land was always yours. All we did was make certain the truth got written down properly." That night, in a small hotel near the depot where they had taken rooms before the long ride back to Willow Bend Crossing, Homer found himself unable to sleep, his mind turning over everything that had happened in the 2 weeks since he had first ridden up to the trading post with no notion of what awaited him there. He rose and went down to the small porch outside the hotel, where he found Lenora already sitting, unable to sleep herself, wrapped in a shawl against the cool night air. "I could not settle my mind either," she said, when he came to sit beside her. "There is a great deal to settle it over," Homer said. 2 weeks ago I was a lonely man who had given up hope of ever seeing my daughter again. Now I have found her, nearly lost her home to a crooked land agent, and discovered along the way that the woman who saved her life is—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Is what?" Lenora asked, watching him carefully. Homer turned to face her fully, and in the pale light of the hotel's lantern, he could see the same careful hope in her eyes that he felt in his own chest. "Is someone I have come to care for a great deal more than gratitude alone would explain," he said finally. "I did not expect this, Lenora. I did not come looking for it, but I find that I do not want to ride away from Willow Bend Crossing and leave you behind, not for the sake of my daughter, and not for my own sake either." Lenora's breath caught, and for a long moment she said nothing, only searched his face as though trying to be certain she had heard him correctly. "I have spent 17 years running that post alone," she said at last. "I gave up any thought of my own family, my own household, the day I decided to raise Grace as my own. I told myself it was enough, that the love I had for her would be enough to fill a life, and it has been mostly. But there have been nights, Homer, more of them than I would like to admit, when I have sat on that porch alone after Grace has gone to bed and wondered if I would spend the whole rest of my life without anyone to share the burden of it with me. "You would not have to wonder that any longer," Homer said quietly. "Not if you would have me." "You are asking me a very large question for a man who has known me only 2 weeks," Lenora said, though there was no rebuke in her voice, only a trembling kind of wonder. "I have known you 2 weeks," Homer agreed. "But I have known your character a great deal longer than that, because I have watched what you built at that trading post, and I have seen what kind of woman raises a stranger's drowning child as her own, and asks for nothing in return but the chance to love her. I do not need years to know a heart like that is rare, Lenora. I lost 12 years already believing I would never again have a family to come home to. I do not intend to waste any more time being cautious about happiness when it is sitting right in front of me." Lenora reached out and took his hand, her fingers cool against his rough, sun-browned skin, and when she spoke again her voice was steady in a way it had not been a moment before. "Then I will not make you wait for my answer either," she said. "I care for you, Homer Lawson, more than I expected to, more than I have allowed myself to care for anyone since I was a young woman with foolish dreams before my father's post, and my responsibilities became the whole of my life. If you are asking whether I would welcome you staying, whether I would welcome building something together, out of all this strange and wonderful mess the river washed up to both our doors, then my answer is yes." They sat together a long while after that, hands clasped, the noise of the railhead town fading into the quiet dark around them, and when Homer finally leaned in to kiss her, it was slow and certain, the kind of kiss two people share when they have both waited long enough to know exactly what they are choosing. They returned to Willow Bend Crossing 3 days later, the matter of the land title settled, and though neither Homer nor Lenora spoke of it directly in front of Grace just yet, an understanding settled quietly between them that had changed the shape of all their futures. Grace, riding a little ahead of them on the trail, seemed to sense some new lightness in the air, some ease that had not been there before the trip to Cheyenne, and when they stopped to rest the horses at a bend in the river not far from the post, she turned to study her father and the woman who had raised her with a curious, knowing look. "You two have been awfully quiet since we left town," she said, "and awfully close." Homer felt heat rise in his face, an unfamiliar sensation for a man who had faced down stampeding cattle and armed rustlers without so much as a flinch, and he glanced at Lenora, who was smiling in a way that told him she did not much mind the question either. "There is something we would like to tell you, Grace," Lenora said, dismounting and coming to stand beside her, "though we wanted to wait until we were somewhere quiet and until you had a chance to gather your thoughts about it before we spoke." "You are courting," Grace said, not a question, and both Homer and Lenora laughed despite themselves at how plainly she had seen through their carefulness. "We are," Homer admitted. "And I want you to know, Josie, that whatever comes of it, nothing changes what I feel for you or what your Aunt Lenora feels for you. You are the reason we found each other in the first place. I could not love you more if I had raised you myself, and I could not be more grateful to the woman who did raise you." Grace's eyes filled with tears, though she was smiling through them. "I have spent my whole life wishing I had a real family," she said. "A mother and a father, not just the fragments of memory I could never quite hold on to. I never imagined I might end up with both, and with each other besides. I think it is the finest thing that could possibly happen, if you want my blessing, which I suspect you do not truly need but which I am giving anyway." Lenora pulled her into an embrace, and Homer watched the two women he loved most in the world hold each other beside the river that had first torn them apart and then, through some strange mercy of fate, delivered them back together, and he thought that perhaps grief and joy were not so far apart as men like to believe, that sometimes the deepest sorrows carried within them the seeds of the greatest happiness, if a person was patient enough and brave enough to let them grow. The wedding took place the following spring, on a clear morning in April of 1879, in the yard behind the trading post at Willow Bend Crossing, with wildflowers blooming along the riverbank, and the whole small community of trappers, ranchers, and travelers who had come to know the post over the years gathered to witness it. Sheriff Wyatt Cowson, who had ridden out from the nearest township to officiate, stood beneath an arch of willow branches that Grace had woven herself, and read the vows in a voice that carried clear across the assembled crowd. Homer wore his best coat, brushed clean of trail dust for the occasion, and when Lenora came to stand beside him in a dress of pale blue calico, sewn by her own hand from fabric not so different from the scrap that had first connected their two families, he felt his heart so full he could hardly speak his vows without his voice breaking. "I, Homer Lawson, take you, Lenora Archer, to be my wife," he said, holding both her hands in his. "I promise to love you not only for the woman you are, but for the woman you were before I ever knew you, the woman who pulled a drowning child from a river and gave her a life out of nothing but the goodness of her own heart. I promise to build with you from this day forward the family that both of us lost hope of ever having." Lenora's voice trembled as she spoke her own vows, but her eyes never left his. "I, Lenora Archer, take you, Homer Lawson, to be my husband. I promise to share with you the burdens I have carried alone for so long, and to trust that love, once found again, does not need to be guarded so carefully against loss. I promise to be a wife to you, and a partner in all things, for as long as we both shall live." When Sheriff Cowson pronounced them married, the small crowd erupted into cheers, and Grace, standing at the front with tears streaming freely down her face, was the first to embrace them both, calling Lenora her mother and Homer her father in the same breath for the very first time, a title both of them had earned in their own ways and both of them accepted with a joy too large to put into words. Among the guests that day was a young cowboy named Caleb Whitfield, one of Homer's own trail hands who had ridden out with the wedding party from Casper, a steady, good-humored young man of 21 who had, over the months since the wedding preparations began, found more reasons than strictly necessary to visit Willow Bend, crossing on errands that always seemed to take a great deal longer than they ought. Grace, for her part, had not failed to notice his visits, nor the way he always seemed to find some excuse to help her carry supplies or mend a fence rail whenever he was near. It surprised no one, least of all Homer, when Caleb approached him quietly after the wedding feast to ask, with the nervous formality of a young man raised to respect his elders, whether he might have permission to court Miss Grace properly, now that matters between the families had been settled. "She is 19 years old and has a mind entirely her own," Homer told him, fighting back a smile at the young man's obvious nerves. "I would not presume to grant or deny permission on her behalf. But I will tell you this, son. If you treat her with the same honesty and care you have shown riding for my outfit these past 2 years, I do not believe you will find much trouble in winning her favor." Caleb did indeed win her favor over the course of that summer, with a patient, gentle courtship that suited Grace's independent nature far better than any grand gesture might have. He took to helping around the trading post on his days off, learning the trade from Lenora with genuine interest, and by the following autumn, when the leaves along the North Platte had turned gold, and the cattle drives had once more brought Homer's outfit past Willow Bend Crossing, Caleb asked for Grace's hand in marriage on the very same porch where Homer had first learned the truth of his daughter's survival. Grace said yes without hesitation, and the following spring, in a ceremony every bit as joyful as her parents had been, she became Grace Whitfield, marrying a good, steady young man who understood the value of the family she had found and who promised, before all their gathered friends, to help her build a life at Willow Bend Crossing that honored both the woman who had raised her and the father who had never stopped searching. Homer sold his ranch outside Casper within the year, unable to bear the distance it put between himself and the family he had so nearly lost forever, and used the proceeds to expand the trading post into a proper way station, complete with a small stable and a second building that served travelers needing lodging on the long trail between the territories. Lenora, who had spent 17 years running the post largely alone, found in Homer not only a husband but a true partner, someone who understood the weight of the work and shared it willingly, and the post prospered under their combined efforts in ways it never had before. 2 years into their marriage, in the winter of 1881, Lenora gave birth to a son, whom they named Silas, after her father, and whom Homer held in his arms on the very night of his birth with the same fierce, protective tenderness he had once felt holding baby Josephine, all those years and all that grief ago. Grace, who had by then given birth to her own first child, a daughter named Clara after the grandmother she had never truly known but whose memory had been carried to her through her father's stories, brought the baby girl to meet her new uncle within days of his birth. And the two households, though separated by only a short walk between the main post and the small ranch house Homer had built nearby, grew so entwined over the following years that visitors passing through Willow Bend Crossing often struggled to sort out exactly which children belonged to which parents. So freely did the whole family move between one another's homes and hearts. Jasper Reed, for his part, never troubled the post again. Word had reached him, through channels neither Homer nor Lenora ever fully learned, that his attempt to exploit a clerical error against a widow's land claim had drawn unfavorable attention from his superiors in the land office, and he was quietly reassigned to a post far to the south, never to darken the trail near Willow Bend Crossing again. The trading post continued to grow, becoming something of a landmark along that stretch of the trail, known not only for its fair prices and honest dealing, but for the story that travelers loved to tell and retell around campfires up and down the territory, the story of the cattleman who had ridden past his own daughter for 11 years without knowing it, and who had found not only her but a wife and a whole new life waiting for him in the last place he ever thought to look. On quiet evenings, long after the supper dishes had been cleared and the children had been put to bed, Homer and Lenora would often sit together on the same porch where they had first spoken so carefully of their fears and their hopes, watching the river slide past in the moonlight, the same river that had once nearly taken everything from Homer and had instead, through some strange and patient mercy, delivered him at last to the family he had spent 12 long years believing he would never find. "Do you ever think on it?" Lenora asked him one such evening, some years into their marriage, her head resting against his shoulder, "how close we all came to never knowing each other at all? If you had taken a different trail west all those years ago, if I had not gone down to the river that particular morning." Homer wrapped his arm around her, watching the dark water catch the last light of the setting sun. "I think on it," he admitted, "but I have come to believe some things are simply meant to find their way home, no matter how long the river carries them, or how far they seem to have drifted from where they began. I passed this post for 11 years, Lenora, never knowing what waited for me here. I think now that some part of me was always coming back, even when I did not know it, even when I had given up all hope of ever finding what I was looking for." Lenora tilted her face up to his, and in the fading light he could see the same steady, patient love in her eyes that had first drawn him to her on that rain-soaked night when their two broken families had finally, impossibly, become whole. "Then I am glad the river carried her here," Lenora said softly, "and I am glad it carried you here too, in its own good time." Homer kissed her gently, there on the porch of the trading post that had once been only a place to buy flour and coffee, and was now, in every way that mattered, home, and somewhere behind them, through the lit windows of the house, they could hear the laughter of their children, Silas and baby Clara, and Grace's voice calling out something warm and teasing to her husband, the whole sound of a family that had been broken by tragedy and mended, against every reasonable expectation, by love. The years that followed brought their share of hardships, as life on the frontier always did, harsh winters and lean seasons and the ordinary griefs that came with growing old. But Homer Lawson and Lenora Archer faced every one of them together, and neither ever again, knew the particular loneliness that had shaped so much of their lives before the day. A cattleman's routine stop at a familiar trading post became the beginning of everything that truly mattered. And Grace, who had once been a nameless child pulled half-drowned from the river's edge, grew into a woman surrounded by more family than she had ever dared to hope for, raising her own children within sight of the very water that had so nearly taken her life, teaching them as she grew older that even the deepest sorrows could be carried downstream towards something better, if a person only had the patience and the courage to let the current take them home.